So let's have a bite. Hey, it's Seraphin, and today we're making these incredibly soft pita breads. One of the main characteristics of this pita bread is that it puffs up. Some say that this puff is unpredictable, a roll of dice of sorts, or that it happens by chance. However, we can't agree with this assessment because ever since we figured out the proper way to do it, we've never failed to get the puffed pita we aimed for. Not to toot our own horn, but it's been a long time since I last saw an unintentionally pocketless pita. But let's get serious. We want this puff to happen not only because it's more appealing, but it's also a sign that our pita bread meets certain standards. First, the ability of the pita to puff tells us that our dough has been properly kneaded and it sports a strong gluten network. Second, for the water to evaporate into steam within our pita bread and help it puff, the internal temperature of our bread must reach at least 100 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, we can be assured that our bread is fully baked, and since the steam is contained within the pita, it also enables us to get a soft internal texture while flipping and heating the flatbread, which eventually leads us to a tender crumb and a slightly rougher crust with browning due to the Maillard reaction that has been shown to enhance the taste significantly. Of course, there's more to add here, but let's first address how we can get a perfectly puffed pita. Well, I'm here to tell you, with a little sprinkle of science, we can easily understand the phenomenon and get it under control. To shed light on why a pita bread puffs, let's take a closer look at what happens to a pita when it cooks on the stove top. When we take a pita from its proofing spot and lay it on the pan, we expose it to heat. To be more specific, it mainly goes through the side that's on the pan via heat conduction. As this side of the pita starts to heat up, we have a range of reactions happening. The yeast act in a frenzy, producing their final spurts of fermentation. Then, as temperatures get hotter, they die off, and the carbon dioxide inside the dough starts to expand. When the dough gets even hotter at 100 degrees Celsius or higher, liquids vaporize, contributing to further rise, and hence we get the puff. Underlying all of these reactions and the puff is a very important law of physics, the first law of thermodynamics. Okay, before you click away, let me reassure you that this is indeed a baking channel. You're not in the wrong place. Although, maybe if you'd like to quickly get to the recipe, then feel free to skip ahead. But if you stick with this opening, then you'll have a better idea of how pita breads puff up, the rationale underlying the specific and derivative ingredients that we use, as well as the amounts thereof. All of this can make for a much more satisfying pita bread baking experience. Now, back to the first law of thermodynamics. This law essentially reformulates the conservation of energy, which states that the total energy of an isolated system remains constant. It is said to be conserved over time. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed, rather, it can only be transferred or transformed from one form to another. In thermodynamics, instead of expressing this principle in terms of energy, the first law of thermodynamics states that the change of internal energy of a system is equal to the heat absorbed by the system minus the external work done by the system. Okay, I know that was a handful of scientific terms, so what's all that got to do with our pita bread? Of course, this law underlies everything, not just pita bread, but I find that pita's puffing make for a very interesting example of the conservation of energy. It's the law in action. Let me illustrate it for you. This good pita can be roughly assumed to be a closed system. Matter cannot go in or out, but energy can. The moment we place the dough on our preheated stovetop pan, the heat of the pan is absorbed by the dough, and as explained before, carbon dioxide gas from the yeast and steam from the water content in the dough eventually expand and are contained inside the practically closed system of the pita dough. All of this contributes to the pressure that pushes the pita wall outward, forcing it to puff up. That's the way we visually see it, and technically speaking, this is the external work done by the dough. All of this shows that energy is conserved because the heat energy from the pan gets transferred into the dough and then gets converted into its expansion, essentially. When you look at it like this, it's almost as if we are guaranteed a puff-up pita due to the first law of thermodynamics. Then why do some people seem to be going out of their wits to get this simple inflation? Remember, this is one of the most cherished laws of physics. So whenever an experiment, in this case the making of our pita bread, seems to violate the law, we are right to be suspicious. Of course, this isn't a rigorous physics experiment, but if our pitas fail to puff, then it's most likely, I can assure you, not a law of physics that's the problem here, but the other factors that enable the puff. So let's investigate. First, the precondition for this law to give us puffed pitas is that it remains a closed system, or as close to one as we can get. As we said before, a closed system is one where energy can both enter and leave, but matter cannot. If our pita is leaking, it is not a closed system, because steam or water vapor is leaving the system. That's our first note. We have to make sure the dough doesn't leak under the gas pressure pushing out from within. Among the many things required is a strong gluten network that can support an elastic skin. This means that not only do we need a flour with sufficient protein content, but it also needs to be kneaded into an extensible and strong gluten network. This gluten network must be able to support the expanding skin of the pita as a result of the rising inner pressure. On this note, we decided on using bread flour for its higher protein content, and also, since we are going to use Tangzhong, it's a known fact that Tangzhong or Yudane denatures protein. So we're limiting the amount of flour we use for Tangzhong to less than 15%, not the usual 20% that we regularly use on our lean dough. This is just a safety measure to ensure we do not unnecessarily weaken the gluten network while making sure that we still have a sufficient amount of gelatinized starch to get super soft pitas that last for much longer. A second precondition required for the pressure to build up within the pita when heated, the dough must have sufficient carbon dioxide and steam. So due to this and the fact that we use Tangzhong, as well as very high protein bread flour, we must have a dough with a relatively high hydration. This recipe that we're going to make is about 71% hydration, a relatively high hydration for flatbreads. This higher hydration not only ensures our pitas will have plenty of steam for them to puff, but it will also ensure that we get the optimal benefits from Tangzhong, enabling our flatbreads to stay fresh and last longer by retaining more moisture. We don't even have to worry about the dough being much more difficult to handle, as Tangzhong also increases the dough tenacity, so it'll make the wet dough easier to knead and work with. You can see the excellent moisture retention qualities of our pitas by looking at this day-old pita that was reheated on the pan and it's still capable of puffing. Amazing, isn't it? This is partly due to the fact that a Tangzhong bread contains a relatively higher amount of moisture as compared to ones without, and this moisture naturally turns into steam that puffs the bread up again. For the third point, while we focused on steam in the previous point, we also want to pay attention to the carbon dioxide produced by the yeast. In regular breads, studies show that only around 10% of the oven spring can be attributed to the final bouts of yeast activity, and around 35% come from the release of carbon dioxide from the solution, with the remaining 55% from thermal gas expansion. Some pita recipes are made without yeast and still end up puffing anyways, but with yeast we found that the pitas are lighter with smaller holes throughout the crumb, and of course much tastier due to fermentation and flavor precursors. So we make sure to ferment the pita dough well, and while we proof the dough for a shorter amount of time in this recipe, that's because we take into account the longer bench rest as well as bulk fermentation. Fourth, we're going to cook our pitas at a temperature of around 220 degrees Celsius. This is the heat source for our expansion. If the pan isn't hot enough, then the pita dough on top of it would not rapidly rise and expand. It would slowly heat up, and by the time the water and gases reach the temperature required to vaporize or expand, the outer crust would already be too stiff and dry to stretch, not the type of flat bread we're aiming for. So make sure your pan is hot. I use an infrared thermometer to make sure, but if you don't have one, you should be able to feel the heat from the pan if you hover your hand above it. Be very careful though, since it is hot. Fifth and last point, pitas were originally baked in scorching hot ovens, and we do our best to emulate those conditions on the pan. Aside from heating it to 220 degrees Celsius, we also need to ensure that the heat the pita is exposed to is relatively even. Conduction is the main mechanism of heat transfer here, so the side directly touching the pan is going to heat up faster than the other side. This is a problem because both sides have the liquids and gases we need to heat up. So we recommend flipping the dough back and forth with 30-second intervals in between. You should, however, stop flipping when you see the pita starting to inflate significantly because you don't want to pop the bubble. With all these tips in mind, let's get to making the recipe. So we're going to start by making the Poolish. I have all my ingredients here. I have 100 grams of flour, 1/8 of a teaspoon of instant yeast, and 100 grams of water. I'm going to add these ingredients in, going in this order, starting with the water first, then the instant yeast, and finally the flour. This way of adding the ingredients will prevent clumps of flour forming at the bottom, and after they're all in the bowl, all that's left to do is mix it with our chopsticks. Making this Poolish is such a simple step, but so important. It really reduces staling, makes the bread softer, and makes it taste absolutely amazing, all of which are incredibly great benefits. So we've got to make sure to give the Poolish the time it needs after we finish mixing it. So I'm just cleaning off my chopsticks here, just tapping any excess Poolish into the bowl. Don't worry about the edges not being so clean, it's perfectly fine. They'll eventually get incorporated later. Now that we're finished making this Poolish, we're going to cover it, set it aside for about 2 hours at room temperature, and then put it in the fridge overnight. If you want the recipe to be done in one day, then you could leave it outside for about 4 hours. But if you leave it overnight, you get a lot more flavor and a better texture, so that's what we prefer to do. Also, because we're not going to use any additional instant yeast other than what we used in the making of the Poolish, we want to make sure that we use the Poolish when it is at its prime. That's the moment after it reaches its peak and starts to recede. The Poolish in such a stage will usually have a nice and extensive gluten network holding in lots of gas pockets. Now let's make our Tangzhong. Okay, I'm going to pour in 100 grams of boiling hot water into this glass bowl. And there you go. Immediately dropping in 50 grams of bread flour, and I'm going to just mix that right away. So this ratio of flour to water is 1:2. Plenty of water for the flour, more than enough for it to fully gelatinize, as long as we mix it quickly. So the minimum temperature required for starch gelatinization is around 65 degrees Celsius, a safe temperature. As long as we get all the flour and water mixed together before the water drops below that temperature, we should have a lot of gelatinized starch. Okay, so it looks homogeneous, it looks well combined. We're going to stop mixing it. I'm going to clean off my spatula, just like that. And then we're going to cover it. So I'm going to cover it first with this cloth because it's going to let that steam pass through. We're just going to set that until it cools to room temperature before we cover it with this silicone cap and put it in the fridge overnight along with the Poolish. So we finished our step of mise en place. Everything's in place and ready to be combined into a dough. Get that nice strong Poolish. Side, open up the Tangzhong. Grams of water, 18 grams of olive oil, 6 grams of salt, 200 grams of bread flour. Now that all the ingredients are in the bowl, we're going to give it a quick mix with the spatula, just like this. So it's going to be quite stiff, especially to start with, because our Poolish and our Tangzhong are both very cold. Okay, this is as far as the spatula can go, so I'm going to clean off the spatula, just scraping off the sides. Set that aside, and we're going to start kneading it by hand. Okay, so now that the dough is mostly combined and it's pretty much solid, we're going to take it out of the bowl and start kneading it on the work surface. This is not a no-knead recipe, so we will be kneading it to full gluten development, scraping out whatever's in the bowl. That aside, and we'll continue kneading. So the proper kneading technique is that you stretch the dough out forward when you knead it like that. Don't press it downwards, press it forward so you get to stretch it out and then fold it back and repeat. If you press it downwards too much, then it may give the illusion of the dough being very sticky or very difficult to handle, when actually it's a perfectly fine dough, it's just a bad method. So to demonstrate, I'm pushing this one forward and folding it back like this. It's a bit sticky, but it's not that bad. If I press it all the way down like that, it's as if it's a very messy, very sticky dough, when actually it's the technique. So I'm just going to continue kneading it. We also have to make sure that the Tangzhong is really well combined. Because of its colloidal state, it takes a little longer to mix in. So make sure to do this quite vigorously. So it normally takes me around 7 to 8 minutes to fully knead the dough until it reaches full gluten development and passes the window pane test. But for this type of thing, you really want to observe the dough. If it doesn't look smooth enough and it doesn't pass the window pane test, then continue kneading. So I can just demonstrate right now a failed window pane test. So you can see I'm stretching out the dough slowly, and there are some parts where light can pass through, but as soon as I try to stretch it even just a little bit thinner, it starts ripping like that. So it looks messy and disorderly, it looks rough. That means it's not done and we have to continue kneading. Thanks to the use of Tangzhong in this dough, you can see that it's quite stiff, kind of tough. Again, that's not gluten strength, that is the Tangzhong. It's because of the perceived dough tenacity, not because of the strength of the dough. The effects that Tangzhong has on the dough, aside from that, is that it's going to have a longer proofing time later on. Due to the lowered protein content, it's going to be a little weaker because the flour in the Tangzhong has been denatured due to the heating process. So we're going to really need to knead this well. And thanks to the Poolish, the dough will be more extensible but not elastic. So it's going to be able to stretch out a little more. This is also due to the proteolytic activity. When we put the flour into the Poolish and mix it with water and then leave it for a long time, that gives the enzymes enough time to break down the proteins, break down the gluten chains into smaller amino acids. A lot of these amino acids are consumed by the yeast, but the ones that remain, they can become flavor precursors, which is part of what's going to make our pitas so delicious. So that's part of why we had to leave the Poolish to rest for so long. So a lot of recipes actually recommend adding a small amount of sugar into the dough. We prefer not to do that for multiple reasons. First and foremost, it's because we wanted this recipe to be a longer, at least slightly longer fermentation recipe, so that it has enough time to build flavor, such as broken down amino acids, etc., in the dough. And when you add sugar, this really boosts the yeast production. So they're going to ferment a lot faster. The dough is going to be done way faster than if we were to just let them break down these sugars by themselves. Second of all, we also already have Tangzhong in the dough. Tangzhong adds a bit of a natural sweetness thanks to the damaged starch and gelatinized starch. These can be broken down by the enzymes into simpler sugars, which we can then taste. So we don't really feel a need to add sugar with all of these factors in mind. I think I'm going to give this dough just 1 more minute of kneading, and it should be done after that. Okay, there you go. You can see it easily coming off of the work surface as well as my hand. Now you can see that the surface is already pretty smooth and it looks pretty good, so I'm going to take off a small piece. I'm going to do a quick window pane test. Pull it up in front of me. And there you can see the light passing through it. All right, now that the dough is done, we're going to shape it a little bit, just make it a bit more compact. And then we're going to transfer it into the bowl where it's going to spend its bulk fermentation. So take it off. And I'm going to give it a little bit of olive oil to line the bowl. Just a little bit is enough. Okay. And I'm just going to smooth it out a little bit, as well as shape it a little more into this round bowl. Okay, great. Drop it in, and I'm gonna cover the bowl. All right, so we're gonna leave the dough to ferment until it doubles in size. Here at a room temperature of about 27 to 28 degrees Celsius, it's gonna take roughly 1 to 2 hours, probably 1.5 hours. So I'm just going to keep an eye on the dough, and when it doubles in size, we'll come back and get ready to work on it. Okay, so the dough has fully expanded, it's doubled in size. We're now ready to begin pre-shaping it. So I'm going to uncover it, and then I'm going to punch it down, take it out, and divide it into around 8 pieces. Okay, so a little bit of flour here, a little bit of flour here. All dusted and then punch down like that. Now to fully degas the dough as well as remix all the nutrients, I'm going to knead it a little bit. When we degas the dough like this, what we're doing is subdividing the already existing gas bubbles into smaller gas bubbles. This will create a more uniform, denser crumb with more small bubbles throughout. All right, so we're done with that. Now I'm going to weigh the whole thing first to get a number for the total weight. Give it a little bit of flour to prevent sticking. 591, and I'm going to divide that by 8, with each weighing around 73 grams. So we divide the dough first before weighing each piece. It's a bit too much on this one. So the dough is still quite tacky. You're going to need to make sure to sprinkle on a little bit of flour here and there to deal with it and prevent it from sticking everywhere. You only need just a little bit of flour though, and try to make sure not too much gets folded into the dough because that'll basically have the effect of changing the hydration and making it a lot denser than it's supposed to be. So use just a little bit like this just to prevent sticking while we handle the dough. So that's the last piece we have to measure out. And from here, we're going to pre-shape the dough into small round balls. Starting with the first dough from just now, just gonna press it into itself and then roll it out with my palm. Make sure not to do this too tightly because we're going to be spreading these out later. This is just a pre-shaping. We don't want them too tense. Just a smooth surface, roughly circular appearance, and we're good. Okay, so we're done pre-shaping the dough. I'm now going to cover it with this cloth. Just like that. All right, so we're gonna leave the dough for 20 minutes as a bench rest because we need that gluten to relax so that when we roll it out later on to make those flat pitas, they can be nice and easy to work with and so they won't tear too. Okay, the bench rest is done, so I'm going to uncover the dough and start shaping them. There, they look relaxed and puffy, and this time for the shaping, we are going to be dusting them with semolina flour. So semolina is coarse ground durum wheat, and it's rough in texture, so it's going to help prevent sticking, and it's also going to add a lot of flavor and texture. Pretty nutty flavor, and the texture being a little coarser like that really adds to the experience. So I'm just going to sprinkle our surface with the semolina, and we're going to take this piece here, flip it over onto the flour. Much like with pizza, we don't need to be worried about getting too much flour onto the dough because we're not going to be doing any folding. We're just going to be flattening the dough out. And I've got my rolling pin here too to help me degas and roll the dough out. Okay. So how thick or thin you roll the pita dough out to really depends on your personal preference. You can leave it a little bit thicker like this if you prefer thicker, denser pitas, or you can get it even thinner for a more light feel. However, you do have to roll it relatively thin compared to most breads, or not, you won't be able to get that puff. And on the flip side, if you roll it out a little too thin, then it can be incapable of getting the puff due to its very weak crust structure. So don't roll it out too thin, don't roll it out too thick, and between that is up to personal preference. So this is definitely more of an aesthetics thing, but if you want to get like a really round dough, then what you need to do is, first of all, you need to make sure to really douse the dough in semolina or the bread flour you're using to prevent sticking. And then after you flatten it out, you can see here that it's still circular, right? So the way you roll it out, don't roll it out back and forth like that without direction. No, roll it out from the center like this, and then press forward. Then go back to the center and then press back. If you keep doing it this way, turning it of course, and doing the same thing again and again, the dough will come out much rounder than if you were to do something like this. So don't do that, do this. Slow and controlled helps you get a much rounder dough. Oopsie. Alright, now that all the pitas are done being shaped, I'm going to cover them with this cloth and leave them to proof. We're not going to let them proof for too long, we just want them to get a bit puffier, so just about 30 minutes will do. Now that they are done proofing, let's cook them. We cook these pitas at around 220 degrees Celsius. Check the temperature before you move the dough onto the pan. We use an infrared thermometer. If you don't have one, then you should be able to feel the heat hovering your hand above the pan. It's got to be pretty hot for the reasons we mentioned in the opening. After 30 seconds, we flip the dough as explained before. This is to make sure both sides of the dough are exposed to a sufficient amount of heat. Now, it can take up to about 2 minutes, so the dough may have to be flipped 3 to 4 times, 30 seconds between each flip, before you see it start to inflate. Once it inflates, you should let it slowly rise. This may take about a minute or so. After it fully rises, give it another 30 seconds before you flip it. Then let it cook for about 1 minute. Flip and cook again until done. Overall, it should take about 5 minutes. Repeat the whole process again for the rest of the pita doughs. And then they are done. These pita breads are incredibly tender on the inside and they're really delicious. They'd make the perfect base for almost any filling, and they still taste amazing even days after they were made. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and bye!